I didn't visit my father in the hospice. He left the nurses a list of things I liked. People will tell you what they think you deserve long after you've stopped asking them to. I learned that fact in a beige hallway on the third floor of Sable Ridge Hospice, 412 days after I'd last spoken to my father. Standing in front of a nurse named Priya, who was holding a spiral notebook I had never seen before in my life. What I did wrong is simple enough to say in one sentence, and I'm not going to spend the next hour making it sound more complicated than it was. My father was dying for 6 weeks, alone, in a building 11 miles from my house, and I did not go. My name is Margaret Holloway, Meg, to almost everyone, though my father never called me that, and I'm 38 years old. I'm a partner at a corporate litigation firm in downtown Denver, the kind of firm where the elevators have brushed steel doors and nobody eats lunch at their desk because it looks like you can't manage your calendar. I make a good living. I have a corner office on the 11th floor with a view of the Front Range that clients comment on before they comment on anything I've said. I'm telling you this fast, almost like a arsum, because that's how I would have told it to you 2 years ago. Profession first, feelings never, and I think you should hear the version of me that existed before this story starts changing that. Let me back up. You need to understand how it started, because none of this happened in a single decision. It happened in about 40 small ones, spread across a decade, and I want to walk you through every single one of them in order. I'll say, up front, that I'm not looking for you to feel sorry for me in the next hour, and I'd ask you to resist the instinct if it comes up, because I've noticed that people extend sympathy faster than they extend judgment, and I think judgment is closer to what this story actually deserves, at least for a while. I did something. I want you to hold that fact plainly, without softening, for as long as you can stand to, because I spent years not holding it plainly myself. And I think that's exactly how a person ends up doing what I did in the first place, by getting very good, very early, at not looking directly at the thing. My father, Walter Holloway, ran a hardware store on Federal Boulevard for 31 years. Holloway's Hardware and Supply, a name he never once considered changing even after the chain stores moved in on both sides of him. He was up at 5:30 every morning of my childhood, no exceptions, not for snow, not for his own birthday, and he made the same pot of coffee in the same percolator he'd owned since before I was born. 3 scoops for the pot even though he only ever drank 1 cup, because he said the smell of it filling the store was worth the extra 2 scoops. He had a habit, when a customer couldn't afford what they needed, and in that neighborhood, over 3 decades, that happened more than most business owners would tolerate, of quietly knocking a few dollars off the register total and telling them it was a manager's discount that applied to nobody but them. That week, for reasons he never specified. He did this so often and so unremarkably that I didn't understand until I was an adult that he was simply giving product away to people who couldn't pay for it, dressed up in language that let them keep their dignity walking out the door. My mother left when I was 9, and after that it was just the 2 of us above the store, in a 2-bedroom apartment that smelled permanently of WD-40 and drywall dust, which I didn't hate as much as I used to tell people I did. My father never remarried, and never, in my hearing, said one critical word about my mother, though I know now that she left him with $11,000 of joint debt he spent almost 4 years paying off alone. On top of raising me. On top of running a store that was already fighting a losing war against Home Depot's opening 2 miles away. He financed my entire law school education, not with a check. He didn't have the kind of money for a check, but with a home equity loan on the apartment building he'd bought outright in 1994, the only real asset he had, co-signed and structured so that if anything happened to me, the debt would land on him and not on my mother's family. which tells you something about who he trusted with the risk of my life. He never once brought up how much he'd borrowed against that building. I found out the number, $83,000, from a bank statement I saw by accident when I was helping him with taxes at 26, and when I asked him about it, he said only, "That's not something you need to carry." That was mine to decide, and changed the subject to whether I'd eaten dinner. He had a Sunday routine, the whole time I was growing up, that I only appreciated as an adult, looking back on it from a distance. Every Sunday morning, before the store opened, he'd drive to a diner 2 blocks over, the same one for 30 years run by the same family, and bring back exactly 2 coffees and 1 paper. And we'd sit at the counter of the hardware store before the doors opened, and he'd read me the sports section while I did homework I usually hadn't started on Friday like I was supposed to. He never once, in all those years, missed a Sunday, even the Sunday after my mother left. Even the Sunday his own father died. He told me once, offhand, that a routine you don't break isn't a habit. It's a promise you keep making without having to say so out loud every time. I didn't understand what he meant by that until much later, when I started noticing how many things in my adult life I'd let slide the moment they became inconvenient. There's a phrase he used constantly, my whole childhood, that I want you to remember, because it comes back at the end of this story in a way I couldn't have predicted. I keep a list. He said it about everything. Customers who needed a callback, parts that were on backorder, birthdays of people who worked the counter for him. He carried a small spiral notebook in his shirt pocket every day of his working life, and he wrote things down in it in a cramped, slanted hand that I used to tease him about being illegible. Once, when I was maybe 12, I asked him what would happen if he lost the notebook. He patted his shirt pocket and said, "Then I'd have to start remembering things the hard way, which is remembering them without writing them down first. Same information, just no proof I ever cared enough to keep it." I didn't think about that notebook again for almost 15 years. My father was not, I want to be clear, a saint dressed up as a hardware store owner. He had a temper he mostly kept in check, but not always. He and I fought, over the years, about my mother's absence, about money, about the fact that he never once asked me to work behind the counter growing up because he wanted, he said, one of us to get out clean, a phrase that used to make me feel like a project rather than a daughter. My Aunt Denise's mother, his sister, thought he was a fool for staying in a failing neighborhood business as long as he did, instead of selling out early and taking a corporate job somewhere with benefits. He wasn't uncomplicated, and I don't want to make him sound uncomplicated now. Because the version of this story where he's simply a saint and I'm simply the villain isn't the true one. It's just the easier one. There was a fight when I was 17 that I still think about more than almost any other memory from that house. I'd applied, without telling him, to a summer internship program downtown that would have taken me away from the store for 8 weeks, and when he found out from a form he happened to see on the counter, he was furious in a way I'd rarely seen from him, not loud. My father was never loud, but cold and clipped, asking why I hadn't simply told him instead of letting him find out by accident. I told him I hadn't wanted to hear him say no. He said, "I've never once told you no about something that gets you further than this store can." I don't know where you got the idea I would. I didn't have a good answer for him then, and it took me another 20 years to understand that the idea hadn't come from anything he'd actually done. It had come from a story I was telling myself about him, a story that made it easier, later, to justify not showing up. I went to law school on his loan and his blessing, and I came out the other side of it a different kind of person than the one who'd grown up above that store, sharper, more careful about who I let see me need anything, more fluent in the specific dialect of confidence that gets you hired at a firm like Ellsworth Bragg, where I started as a first-year associate at 26 on $160,000 a year, more money in 12 months than my father had ever made in 3 combined. I want to be honest that I liked what that money did to how people looked at me. I liked it more than I liked almost anything else about the job, and I think that fact is the beginning of everything that went wrong between my father and me, even though it would be years before it showed up as an actual decision I made against him. The specific wrong I did, the one this story is built around, happened when I was 31 in my 5th year at Ellsworth Bragg, the year I was up for early partner consideration. My father called me on a Thursday in March to tell me, in the same flat, unbothered voice he used for everything, that a regional franchise called Praxis Home was buying up the block his store sat on, that they'd made an offer for his building through a shell entity, and that when he declined, their lawyers had started sending letters alleging code violations on a property he'd owned outright and maintained meticulously for 28 years. He wasn't asking me for money. He made that explicit on the call. He was asking me, as a lawyer, to look at the letters and tell him whether they had anything real, because the local attorney he'd consulted for a $50 office visit had told him it might cost $12,000 to fight it properly, and Walter Holloway did not have $12,000 sitting anywhere. "I don't want you to feel like this is your problem, Meg," he said on that call. And I remember exactly where I was standing, in the kitchen of my apartment with a glass of wine I hadn't finished. Because I've replayed the sentence enough times that the room comes with it. I just wanted a second set of eyes. You don't have to do anything. Just tell me if I'm being foolish for wanting to fight it. I told him I'd look at it. I meant it, in the moment. I want to be honest that I meant it. I did look at it, for about 40 minutes on a Tuesday night, and I could see immediately that the code violations were manufactured, thin, the kind of pretextual harassment a firm like Praxis used specifically because it worked on small owners who couldn't afford to fight it out in discovery. I knew 2 associates at a real estate litigation boutique who handled exactly this kind of predatory acquisition case and would have taken it for a fraction of what Praxis was hoping to spend grinding my father down. I had, at that point in my life, every professional tool required to help him, and it would have cost me almost nothing. What it would have cost me was visibility. Ellsworth Bragg represented, at the time, 3 different regional commercial developers, and while none of them were Praxis specifically, the managing partner overseeing my partnership track, a man named Curtis Wayborn, had made it clear in more than one hallway conversation that scrappy little tenant disputes weren't the kind of pro bono profile the firm liked its rising partners associated with, that our brand, his word, was institutional, not sentimental. 6 months earlier, at a firm retreat in Vail, Curtis had used almost that exact phrase about a different associate who'd taken on a rent control case for a family friend, and the story had circulated through the associate ranks as a kind of cautionary tale, the way stories about who gets passed over always do. I never told my father any of this. I told him, on a call I placed from my car in the parking garage under my building, that I'd had the letters reviewed by someone who does this kind of work and that fighting it probably wasn't worth the cost relative to what he'd recover, which was a lie constructed entirely out of true-sounding fragments, the specialty of a good litigator. He said, "All right, you'd know better than me." He did not sound convinced. He sounded like a man deciding not to argue with his daughter. Praxis took the building 11 months later, not through a lawsuit, they never had to file one, but through the slow financial suffocation of legal fees my father paid, trying to fight code citations he couldn't ignore. On a store already losing money to the chains, until the equity he had left made selling the only rational option. He got $61,000 for a building and a business that fought properly, a real estate litigator told me years later, after it no longer mattered, would likely have been worth closer to $400,000 once the harassment claim was factored in as leverage. I have never told anyone at Ellsworth Bragg this story. I made partner 14 months after my father lost the store. I want you to sit with that timeline the way I've had to. There was a specific moment, on that Tuesday night with the letters spread on my kitchen table, that I think of as the real hinge of this story, more than the loss of the store itself. My colleague, a mid-level associate named Priya Anand, who is not the same Priya you'll meet later in this story, though the coincidence has never stopped bothering me, saw the file on my desk the next morning and asked whose case it was. I told her it was my father's building. She said, without hesitating, "You could absolutely make this go away for him. This is exactly the pattern the Kessler team wrote a memo about last year." I told her it was complicated. She looked at me for a second longer than the sentence required and said, "It's really not though, that was the off-ramp. It was sitting right there, offered to me by someone with no stake in the outcome at all, and I closed the laptop and went to a client meeting instead." There was a second off-ramp, smaller than the first, that I've told fewer people about than almost anything else in this story. About 4 months after the store sold, my father called me to say he'd found a small storefront 2 blocks over, half the square footage, rent he thought he could manage on what was left of the $61,000. And asked if I'd look over the lease before he signed anything, just so nobody pulls a fast one twice. It would have taken me 20 minutes. I told him I was buried in a trial prep that week, which was true, and that he should have Denise's husband, who'd done a semester of paralegal coursework once, take a look instead. He said that was fine, no trouble, and thanked me for the suggestion in a tone that had nothing accusatory in it at all. The storefront deal fell through 3 weeks later over a personal guarantee clause Denise's husband hadn't known to flag, the exact kind of clause I would have caught in the first read. My father never reopened the store. I didn't think about that 20 minutes again until I was standing in a hospice hallway years later, though I understand now it was sitting in me the entire time. Filed under a different name. I told myself that helping my father would look, to Curtis and to the partnership committee, like I still saw myself as a hardware store owner's daughter, rather than a future partner at a firm with a name like Ellsworth Bragg on the letterhead. I told myself that my father would be fine either way, because he'd survived worse than a bad year at the store. I told myself that this was a single decision, isolated, not a pattern, and that I could make it up to him later, with money, once I'd made partner and had more of it to give. Every one of those sentences felt reasonable at the time. None of them were true in the way I needed them to be. For 6 years after that, the relationship between my father and me existed in a kind of low, managed frost that neither of us ever named out loud. I called him on holidays. I sent a check every December that he never cashed for longer than a month, as if cashing it quickly would have made it feel like something other than what it obviously was. I told myself, in the specific language I'd gotten good at using with myself, that my father and I had simply grown into different lives. A phrase I used at a dinner party once, describing my own family, to a table of people who nodded like it was a normal thing people said. My career, in that same stretch, did nothing but accelerate. I made senior partner at 34, the youngest in the firm's history at the time. I bought a house in Cherry Creek with a kitchen island bigger than the apartment I grew up in. I told people when the topic came up that my mother left when I was young and my father and I weren't close, which was true in the way a lie can be built entirely out of technically true fragments. I want to be specific about how ordinary those years felt from the inside, because I think that's the part people underestimate about a silence like this. It doesn't feel dramatic while it's happening. It feels like a Tuesday. I'd wake up, run 4 miles along the Cherry Creek Trail, be at my desk by 7:30, bill somewhere between 10 and 12 hours most days, and go to bed having thought about my father, if I thought about him at all, for maybe 90 seconds total. Usually while scrolling past a hardware store ad or hearing someone else complain about a difficult parent at a dinner party. I got engaged during that stretch to a man named Ethan I was with for 2 years, and he asked me once, early on when he'd meet my father, and I told him eventually, and eventually never came, and by the time we broke up, for reasons that had nothing to do with my father. Or so I told myself, he'd never once been in the same room as the man who raised me. There were cracks, though, small enough that I filed each one away instead of looking at it directly. 3 winters in, my father had a fall in the parking lot of a Walgreens and broke his wrist, and I found out about it a full 8 days later, from my cousin Denise, in a Facebook message that opened with "Hope you already knew about this." I hadn't. I called him that night and he said it was nothing, already healed up, in a voice that made it clear he wasn't going to make me feel worse about not knowing than I already did, which somehow made it worse. 4 winters in, I let a call from him go to voicemail during a client dinner and didn't listen to the message for 11 days, and when I finally did, it was just him asking if I remembered the name of a movie we used to watch together, nothing urgent, nothing that needed me, which I told myself proved I hadn't actually missed anything important. 5 winters in, driving past the old block on Federal for a case that had nothing to do with him, I saw that the building that used to be Holloway's Hardware was now a vape shop with a sun-faded awning, and I sat in traffic outside it for almost 4 minutes without turning my phone on to call him, telling myself I'd do it later that night. I didn't. Somewhere in that same 5th year, Denise called me, one of maybe 6 calls total from her across that entire stretch, and asked, carefully, whether I knew my father had started going to the free clinic on Colfax instead of his regular doctor, because his insurance situation had gotten complicated after the store closed. I told her I didn't know that, and she let a silence sit on the line long enough that I understood it was meant to land the way it landed. "He wouldn't want you to feel bad about it," she said, which is a sentence I've come to understand my family uses instead of "you should feel bad about it," and which works, somehow, even more effectively than the direct version would have. There's one more memory from that stretch I want to include, even though it's smaller than the others, because I think the smallness is the point. It was my 35th birthday, 2 years before the diagnosis, and my father sent a card, not a call, a card, actual paper, which by then felt almost anachronistic, with a $50 bill folded inside it and a single line in his slanted handwriting, "Take yourself somewhere nice." I put the $50 in a drawer and never spent it, and I never called to thank him properly. Just sent a text that said, "Thanks, Dad, love you," 3 days later, the kind of message you send while doing something else entirely. I found that same $50 bill, still folded, in the drawer the week after his funeral, and understood, looking at it, that I had managed to turn even a birthday gift into another small, quiet distance between us, without ever once intending to. I want to be honest that I wasn't unhappy during those 6 years, which is the detail that troubles me most in retrospect. I wasn't lying awake at night riddled with guilt about my father. I was, by almost every external measure, thriving, promoted, engaged, respected, busy in a way that felt purposeful rather than evasive. The absence of my father from my life didn't announce itself as an absence most days. It just quietly reshaped the size and shape of what I considered my life to be. The way water finds a new channel without ever seeming to struggle, and I think that quietness is exactly what makes a silence like this one so easy to sustain for years instead of months. Nothing forces you to confront it. There's no single dramatic moment demanding a decision. There's just the next Tuesday, and the one after that, each one a little easier to let pass than the last. I've asked myself since whether I would have described those 6 years differently at the time if someone had asked me directly whether I was estranged from my father. I don't think I would have used that word. I think I'd have said something softer. We're not as close as we used to be, maybe, or it's complicated. Because the word estranged carries an implication of rupture, of a single identifiable break, and what actually existed between us was quieter than that, more like erosion than fracture, a thing that happens so gradually you can go years without noticing how much ground has actually gone. It's a distinction that matters more than it sounds like it should, because erosion doesn't ask permission and it doesn't announce itself with a date you can point back to. You only see the damage once you're standing at the edge of it, looking down at how far the ground has actually receded while you were busy calling it something smaller. The call that ended the silence came on a Sunday afternoon in October from a woman named Denise, my cousin, my father's niece. The only member of that side of the family who'd stayed close to him after my mother left, and she told me, in a voice I could hear was working hard to stay level, that my father had been diagnosed 8 months earlier with pancreatic cancer, that he'd been in and out of treatment without telling me any of it, and that he had, 3 days prior, been moved into Sable Ridge Hospice on East Colfax, and that the doctors weren't giving him more than 6 to 8 weeks. I asked her why nobody had told me sooner. She said, and I remember this exactly, he told me not to. He said you had enough going on. I did not go that day. I told myself I needed to process it, that I'd go that week, that showing up in a panic wouldn't help either of us. I told myself a version of that sentence for 6 weeks, and in that entire span, I visited my father exactly 0 times. I sent flowers once to the hospice front desk with a card that said, "Thinking of you, Meg," which I now understand is one of the more cowardly documents I have ever produced, professionally or personally, in a career built entirely on producing documents. I called twice. Both times he sounded tired, but entirely himself, asking about my cases, asking whether I was eating properly. Never once asking why I hadn't come, which I read at the time as him letting me off the hook, and which I understand now was something closer to him protecting me from having to answer a question he already knew the answer to. He died on a Thursday in December, 6 weeks, and 2 days after Denise's phone call, and I found out from a hospice social worker rather than from Denise. Because Denise, I learned afterward, had been too angry with me by that point to be the one to make the call. I drove to Sable Ridge 2 days later to collect his belongings, which is where I met Priya, a hospice nurse, mid-30s, who had cared for my father for the better part of those 6 weeks, and who greeted me at the 3rd-floor desk with a level of formal politeness that told me, before she said a single unkind word, exactly what she thought of me. The hallway smelled like the inside of every institutional building I'd ever been in, a mix of disinfectant and something floral trying too hard to cover it, and there was a corkboard near the nurses' station with photos pinned to it. Residents and families. A mismatched collage of birthdays and holidays. I didn't look for my father's photo on it. I found out later there wasn't one, because I was never there to take it. She handed me a manila envelope with his few personal effects, his watch, a pair of reading glasses, his wallet, and then, almost as an afterthought, a spiral notebook I recognized instantly, the same kind he'd carried in his shirt pocket my entire childhood. The cramped, slanted handwriting unmistakable even from across the desk. "He wanted you to have this," Priya said. "He asked us to keep a few things from it current actually while he was here. He said it was important we got it right." I asked what she meant. She opened the notebook to a page near the back and turned it toward me. It was a list. 2 columns, dated across the top in his handwriting from 8 weeks earlier, the week he was admitted. "Things Meg likes," it said, underlined once. Below it, her coffee, black, no sugar. She says sugar in coffee is for people who don't actually like coffee. Doesn't eat red meat well done, orders it medium. Gets embarrassed if the table makes a joke about it. Loves the Rockies even though the team's been bad for years, won't admit it out loud. Cries at the end of the movie with the lighthouse even though she says she doesn't, watched it 4 times growing up. Hates when people finish her sentences. Below that, in a slightly different pen, added later, Priya told me he'd asked for updates whenever a nurse or aide happened to mention something. Whenever a detail surfaced in idle conversation he could add to the record. He didn't like people to fuss, one line said, next to my name, in a hand that was noticeably less steady than the rest of the page. He'll say he's fine when he isn't. Ask twice. He gave this to us the first week, Priya said. He told us if you came in, we might not know much about you, since you two hadn't seen each other in a while, and he didn't want the staff treating you like a stranger if you walked through that door. He wanted us ready. In case. She said the last 2 words carefully, and I understood, standing there, that in case had been doing an enormous amount of work in my father's mind for 6 weeks, that he had spent some portion of nearly every day of his dying updating a list of my preferences for nurses to use on a visit he must have known, by week 4 or 5, was very unlikely to come. I asked Priya, because I needed to hear it stated plainly and couldn't yet say it myself, whether he'd talked about me. Every day, she said. Not in a sad way. He'd just mention things. What you were like as a kid. What you did for work. He was proud of you in a way that didn't need you in the room to exist, if that makes sense. I've done this job 11 years. Most people, it fades toward the end, or it turns bitter. His didn't do either. She paused, and I think this was the moment she decided I deserved the full truth, rather than the professional version. He asked, toward the last week, if we thought you were coming. I told him I didn't know. He said that's all right. She's got a lot on her. And then he asked us to double-check the coffee thing was written down correctly, because he wasn't sure if he'd already put it on the list twice. There was one more thing Priya told me, standing at that desk. That I didn't fully understand the weight of until later. She said that on one of his last coherent afternoons, he'd asked her to read the list back to him, start to finish, and that when she got to the end he'd said, "That's a good girl, isn't it?" Not as a question, really, more like a man confirming something to himself out loud one last time before he stopped being able to confirm anything. Priya said she'd told him yes, and that he'd nodded and closed his eyes and didn't ask her to read it again after that. Before I left the 3rd floor that day, Priya walked me down the hall to the room he'd stayed in, which had already been cleaned out and reassigned, the way these rooms always are, quickly, out of necessity rather than callousness. She stopped outside the door anyway and told me one more thing, unprompted, the kind of detail I don't think she was required to share, and gave me only because she'd decided, by then, that I could be trusted with it. The window in that room faces the parking lot, she said. He asked, most mornings, if I'd open the blinds so he could watch people come in. He never said who he was watching for. I think we all knew anyway. I didn't ask her anything else after that. There wasn't anything else to ask that would have made the sentence less true. I want to tell you I broke down in that hallway because it would make a cleaner story, but that's not what happened. What happened is that I stood very still, holding a spiral notebook that weighed almost nothing, and did the math on exactly how long my father had known he was dying and never once used that knowledge to make me feel guilty for not coming, And I understood with a clarity that felt almost clinical exactly how much room he had made, his entire life, for me to be exactly as absent as I chose to be, without ever once telling me the cost of it. I drove home and didn't open the rest of the envelope for 4 days. When I finally did, in the last section of the notebook, behind the list, I found something else. A folded bank document. A decade old. A wire transfer confirmation for $11,200, dated the same month I'd made partner. I didn't recognize the transaction. I called the number listed on the letterhead, a small regional bank in the neighborhood where the store used to be, and after being transferred twice, I reached a loan officer, an older woman named Carol Ostrander, who had been with the branch for over 20 years and remembered my father by name before I even finished explaining who I was calling about. "Your father came in about 11 years ago," Carol said, asking about a matter with Ellsworth Bragg. "I remember because it's not a name you forget. All those partners' pictures in the lobby downtown." He didn't explain the details, just said there'd been a mistake made by a young associate at the firm, a missed filing deadline on something, and that it had put the firm at risk of a malpractice claim that could have followed the associate personally, could have ended a career before it started. He said the client involved was willing to settle quietly for $11,200 rather than escalate it if it came from an outside source, and the firm never had to disclose it internally. He took out a personal loan against the equity he had left in his apartment building, which wasn't much by then, and he wired it directly to the client's attorney. Structured it so there'd be no paper trail back to the firm at all. I asked him once, years later, why he never told the associate what he'd done. He said it wasn't the kind of thing you tell someone. He said if she knew, she'd spend the rest of her career feeling like she owed somebody something, and he didn't want that for her. He wanted her to think she'd just been lucky. I asked Carol if she remembered anything else about that day, a small detail, anything, and she said the one thing that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else in this story. He asked me, before he left, if the wire could go out same day. I told him it could, for a fee. He said the fee didn't matter. He said, "I don't want this sitting overnight where something could go wrong with it." Like he was more worried about the transfer failing than he was about the money. I understood, hearing that my father had treated an $11,000 act of anonymous protection for a daughter who hadn't spoken to him in months with more urgency than most people treat their own emergencies. Carol told me one more thing before we hung up, unprompted, in the tone of someone who'd clearly thought about this call after it happened, more than once. Over the years, he came back into the branch maybe 8 months later just to check the account was closed out properly, no lingering balance anywhere that could surface unexpectedly. I told him everything was clean. He said, "Good. She never has to know it existed." I remember thinking at the time that was an odd thing to want, for your own daughter to never know you'd done something like that for her. I understand it a little better now, hearing you explain what happened between the two of you. I think he wanted you to believe the good things in your life were entirely your own doing. I think that was the gift, as much as the money was. I did not, in that call with Carol Ostrander, need to ask which associate. I remembered the missed deadline she was describing, a Rule 26 disclosure I'd let slip through the cracks in my second year, during the worst stretch of a case I was drowning in, a mistake that should have ended with a malpractice claim against the firm and a formal mark against my name that would have followed me to every partnership committee for the rest of my career. It had instead simply disappeared, resolved, I'd always assumed, by the firm's insurance carrier or some senior partner's quiet intervention, the kind of thing that happens at firms like Ellsworth Bragg and nobody ever explains to a second-year associate. I had spent 11 years believing I'd been lucky, My father had spent 11 years watching me build an entire career, make partner, buy a house in Cherry Creek on a foundation that included a debt he'd taken out against the only asset he had left, in the exact same window I was too embarrassed by his hardware store to help him save it. I sat with that arithmetic for a long time. My father lost his building, in part because I decided helping him wasn't good for my image at a firm that had already, unknown to me, been quietly protected from my own worst professional mistake by that same man, on his own dime, without ever telling me, without ever asking for anything back, not gratitude, not visits, not even an accurate accounting of what he'd sacrificed to do it. I misjudged what my father was capable of giving, and I misjudged more specifically my own understanding of what I owed him. Because I had spent 11 years thinking of myself as the more successful of the two of us, the one who'd climbed out, the one supporting him with an uncashed check every December, when the actual ledger, it turned out, ran almost entirely in the other direction. I thought about the phrase he used my whole childhood: "I keep a list," and understood for the first time that it had never really been about back orders and callbacks. It was about the specific discipline of a man who believed that keeping track of people, quietly, without telling them you were doing it, was simply what love looked like when you didn't trust yourself to say the word out loud. I went back, in my head, to the Sunday mornings at the diner counter, the 2 coffees, the sports section he read out loud while I did homework I hadn't started. I understood, revisiting it with everything I now knew, that the routine he never broke, not the Sunday after my mother left, not the Sunday his own father died, was the same instinct that made him wire $11,000 same day, so nothing could go wrong with it overnight. The same instinct that made him update a spiral notebook in a hospice bed for 6 weeks. He didn't know how to say a thing directly. He only knew how to keep showing up for it, in whatever form showing up was still available to him, for as long as his body would let him. I thought, too, about the manager's discount he used to give customers who couldn't pay, the small, disguised kindnesses that let people keep their dignity walking out the door. I understood, finally, that I had been the recipient of exactly that kind of discount my entire life, structured so carefully that I never once had to feel the weight of what it cost him. The $11,000 wire transfer wasn't an anomaly. It was the same manager's discount, scaled up, applied to his own daughter instead of a stranger buying pipe fittings on credit, and I had spent a decade mistaking it for luck because that's exactly what he'd wanted me to mistake it for. I also thought, more than once in those first weeks, about the 17-year-old fight over the internship, and about how neatly I had rearranged my own memory of my father over the years to make my later distance from him feel justified rather than chosen. I had told myself, in the vaguest terms, some version of a story where he'd have held me back if I let him, where distance was self-preservation rather than convenience, and it took his death and a bank officer named Carol Ostrander to show me that story had never been true. He had spent his whole life pushing me toward exactly the kind of success that eventually made me too embarrassed by him to help him keep his own building. That's not a contradiction he ever pointed out to me. I don't think he ever let himself see it as one, either, or if he did, he decided it wasn't his to hold against me. There is no scene, in this story, of me confronting my father, because by the time I understood any of this, he was 3 weeks in the ground. The confrontation I got instead was smaller and worse in its way, an empty apartment I had to clear out. His percolator still sitting on the counter with the same 3 scoops of grounds dried into the basket, a version of the conversation that could only happen in my own head. Standing in a kitchen that smelled faintly, still, of coffee he hadn't lived to drink. I stood there and said his name out loud. Once. Into the empty room. The way you do when there's no one left to hear it and you need to hear it said anyway. Nobody answered. That's the whole scene. I've stopped expecting one where somebody does. I did have one conversation, though, that came close to a confrontation, even if it wasn't with him. It was with Curtis Wayborn, 3 weeks after the funeral, in his office on the 12th floor. The one with the better view than mine. I told him, not asking permission, just informing him, that I was taking on a pro bono case that fall, representing a small business owner in a dispute with a regional developer. The exact kind of scrappy little tenant dispute he'd once told a room full of associates the firm didn't want its name near. He looked at me for a moment, the way people look at you when they're deciding whether a fight is worth having, and said, "That's an unusual use of your time, Meg." I told him it wasn't unusual at all, that it was actually the most useful thing I'd do with my time all year, and that I'd be handling it personally rather than delegating it down. He didn't argue further. I don't know if that was respect or simple math on his part. I'd made partner. I brought in more revenue than the case would ever cost the firm's reputation, but I took the case anyway, and I've taken 2 more like it since, and I think about my father every time I file the first motion. What I did instead of a confrontation was slower and less satisfying, which I've come to think is the more honest shape repair actually takes. I went to Carol Ostrander's bank 3 weeks later and paid off, in full, the remaining balance on the loan my father had taken out against the apartment building. A debt Denise had inherited responsibility for, since the building had passed to her in his will, along with the last of what he owned, a decision he'd made. I learned from the will itself, specifically because he said I didn't need it and she did, a sentence I read 6 times before I understood it wasn't an insult. It was the truest compliment he'd paid me in a decade. I didn't tell Denise I'd paid it off anonymously the way he'd paid off my mistake anonymously. I told her exactly what I'd done, and why. Because I decided, standing in that bank, that the version of love that hides itself from the person it's protecting was his, not mine. And I didn't have the right to borrow it. Denise and I are not close the way she and my father were, and I don't think we will be. Not fully, not soon. She told me, the day I explained the loan, "I'm glad you did it. I'm not going to pretend that fixes 6 weeks." I told her I wasn't asking her to pretend that. She asked me, that same afternoon, why it had taken his death for me to do anything at all. And I didn't have a clean answer for her. I told her the truth, which was that I'd had the tools to help him for years and had decided, every single time, that using them cost more than it was worth to me. And that I didn't think there was a version of that answer that made her feel better, and I wasn't going to try to make one up just to end the conversation more comfortably. She nodded, and we sat in a silence that wasn't warm, but also wasn't hostile, which felt, at the time, like the most honest place the 2 of us could actually be. Before I left that day, she said one more thing, quieter than the rest. "He used to tell me you were just like him. Stubborn, careful, bad at saying things out loud until it was almost too late to say them." I told her I didn't know whether to take that as a compliment or a warning. She said both, probably. That's usually how he meant things. We have dinner now, every few months, at a diner 2 blocks from where the store used to be. Not the same one from my father's Sunday routine, that one closed years ago, but close enough that the neighborhood still feels like his. And she tells me things about him I didn't know. Small things, mostly, the kind that don't add up to forgiveness so much as they add up to a fuller picture of a man I apparently only ever saw a third of. She told me once that in his last working years at the store, after I'd made partner, he kept a photo of me from my law school graduation taped inside the cash register drawer, where only he would see it, dozens of times a day, and never told me. It is slower than I want it to be. I've decided that's appropriate. I also went back, that same spring, to a woman named Renata Cole, an associate I'd once known at a real estate litigation boutique. The kind of firm that could have taken my father's case a decade earlier for a fraction of what it eventually cost him, who had since made partner herself, and asked whether she'd be willing to consult with me on structuring a modest legal aid fund through Ellsworth Bragg for small commercial tenants facing exactly the kind of predatory harassment Praxis had used against my father. She said yes almost immediately, and asked what had prompted it. I told her the truth in about 4 sentences, the shortest version of this story I've ever given anyone, and she didn't offer sympathy, which I was grateful for. She just said, "Good, let's build it properly then." And we did. Building it properly took longer than either of us expected. 9 months of committee approvals, budget lines. A partnership vote I had to sit through, knowing that Curtis Wayborn, of everyone in that room, understood exactly why I was pushing for it, though neither of us ever said so directly. The vote passed, 11-2, and afterward Curtis stopped me in the hallway and said only, "Your father would have liked that this took 9 months instead of 9 minutes." Some things are worth the paperwork. It was the closest he ever came to acknowledging what he already knew, and I didn't ask him to say more than that, because I understood by then that some sentences are more honest for staying short. We named the fund, quietly, without any press release or announcement, the Holloway Tenant Protection Initiative, and I told Renata I didn't want my name attached to the launch materials, only his. She asked why, and I told her that if he'd wanted credit for the things he did for people, he'd have taken it while he was alive, and that the least I could do was let the fund carry the name the way he actually lived. Visible in its effect. Invisible in its origin. In its first year, the fund took on 11 cases, 6 of them resolved before trial, all 6 in favor of the small business owner. I don't tell people at the firm the story behind why I started it. A few have asked. I usually just say it's personal, and most people, to their credit, don't push past that. I kept the notebook. It sits in the top drawer of my desk at the firm now, not the house, the firm, specifically, where I see it every day I walk in, which I've come to understand is the point of keeping it there rather than somewhere softer. I added 1 line to it myself, on the back page, in handwriting that doesn't match his cramped, careful slant at all, I know now. I'm sorry it took a list to tell me. I haven't shown that page to anyone. I'm not sure I ever will. I think, sometimes, about what would have happened if I'd simply gone to Sable Ridge once, any one of those 6 weeks, even for 20 minutes, even having nothing prepared to say. I don't know what that visit would have changed about the 11 years before it. I know it would have meant he didn't spend his last coherent afternoon asking a stranger to read a list back to him and confirm, out loud, that I was still a good girl, a question I should have been in the room to answer myself. That's not a wound I get to close by paying off a loan, or building a legal aid fund with my father's name quietly attached to it, which I did eventually. Though I haven't told you that part yet, because it isn't the kind of thing I want to end on as if it settles the account. It doesn't settle anything. It's just the next thing you do, and then the next thing after that, for as long as you're given to keep doing it. I still drive past the vape shop on Federal Boulevard sometimes, on purpose now, which I never used to do. I don't stop. I don't need to. I just slow down for the length of the block, the way you'd slow down passing a house you used to live in, and then I keep going to wherever I was actually headed, which is, I've come to think, the most honest description available of where I am with all of this, still moving, slower than before, past the thing rather than through it. Because through it isn't a place that exists for me anymore. The thing I'd say to you, if you're sitting with your own version of a phone call you let go to voicemail, is this: the people who love you the most quietly are rarely the ones asking you to notice. That's not an excuse to wait. It's the reason waiting costs more than you think it does. Because the bill doesn't come due while they're alive to soften it for you. It comes due after, itemized in someone else's handwriting, and by then, there's no version of paying it back that gets you the thing you actually wanted, which was never the money at all. It was just more time in the room with someone who was keeping track of you the entire time you thought you'd stopped mattering to him. If this story moved you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more honest, family-centered stories.